Matthew 23 is a fascinating passage. Jesus issues 7 woes to the Pharisees, and 7 is a number that occurs frequently throughout the Bible, or multiples of 7. And so I would like a scholar sometime to explain to me what the significance of the 7 woes are. But it starts out that Jesus says about the Pharisees that they sit in Moses' seat. Now, this is the seat of authority, biblical authority, not the Pharisees themselves, but you'll find in the New Testament that references made to Moses or to Abraham or to the prophets, because they were the men that God spoke to officially through to Israel. And so a Pharisee would not say, "I say unto you," he would say, "Moses, as Moses says." And so that authority is something that's important in the Bible. And the lesson for us today is the Bible says, a very familiar statement by Billy Graham. And now we got a bunch of pros here. But anyway, Jesus says you sit in Moses' seat. In other words, they're interpreting the authority of the Torah and the prophets to the people of Israel. And so they are sharing the communication of authority to God's people. And that's a legitimate role in Scripture. Pastors do that. They say the Bible says such and such. And so it's not their authority, it's the Bible's authority. But Jesus goes on to tell them that whatever they tell you to observe, do it, but don't do as they do. In other words, and Jesus is saying this with the Pharisees there. He's saying this in a way that the message is clear. You guys are hypocrites. But then in the 7 woes, he says this repeatedly. They do their works to be seen of men, and that reminds me of what Jeff Van Vonderen says, that how things appear is more important than how they really are. And I've always thought that there are 2 tracks, 2 poles, so to speak, in religion, any religion. That one is performance, legalistic. The other is mystical, inward. Legalism is outward. Mysticism is inward. And when we're looking at world religions or cults, we can see that dichotomy or that separation from one group to another. But Jesus says in verse 13, he begins the woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut up the kingdom of heaven. Now, and when we look at the cults, we can see that disfellowshipping, excommunication, is a way of shutting up the kingdom of heaven, or the paradise on earth, or whatever term they use. But this power over someone's eternal destiny is common in the cults, that they will hold that over the people. The next one is, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses. In other words, the sheep are to be fleeced for the benefit of the leaders, and not for the benefit of God or people who need legitimate help. 15 says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. The interesting thing that I have used this verse a lot to explain to Christians why it's difficult to win people out of the cults. That when people are converted into a cult, they were at square one in their spiritual state, They need to take the next step, begin moving towards God, but they're kind of in a neutral location. And the Pharisees come along and they recruit him to their cause, and he becomes convinced and begins to perform in his life according to the standards that the Pharisees laid out. And so to break someone free from a commitment like that is difficult. And so that's why he's doubly a child of hell as before. And so that's why it's difficult to get people out of Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, or some other. And then verse 18, Jesus says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple." And so this oath making is sort of like a crutch. When you lack persuasive authority of your own, you swear by something greater than yourself to affirm what you're saying. And you'll find this frequently in all the cults, that they will claim their uniqueness. They will say that God speaks to you through us, the sole channel for the flow of biblical truth to man on earth today, or we must sustain the prophet, or something along this line, that someone has come in between God and the individual, and so your loyalty to God is expressed by your loyalty to whoever is in between you and God. And then in verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrite, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin." So this, in the case of the Pharisees, the tithe that they were paying was on their garden plots. They were not farmers out in the field raising herds or crops. They had a garden plot where they raised their own herbs and spices, and so they paid a tithe on that. Well, that's fine, but it's really getting down to the fine point. It's like the Sabbath day's journey. They defined the Sabbath day's journey as that distance outside of your village. You can walk around in your village all day long, but not a Sabbath day's journey beyond that. So it's this adherence to the fine points of the law that is a big thing to the legalist. And then the next one is they cleanse the outside of the cup. Again, how things appear is more important than how it really is. And the next one is like that. You're like whitewashed tombs. There's splendor on the outside, but it's rotten inside. So Jesus is laying the Pharisees low in his woes to them. But I want to get in now to the roles that are played in high control groups. The Pharisees in this would have been the tyrants in my 5 roles that are found in high control groups. The tyrant is at the top. He frequently will be a controller kind of person. There's a book that I read a number of years ago, and I don't know if you can still get it for free, but last name of the author is Setzer, and it's Broken Hearts, Shattered Trust, and it's about the associate pastors in megachurches. That when you have a narcissist person in the senior position, it's a living hell to be an associate pastor under him. And we saw that worked out in a church that we were in Columbus, that the church just divided right down the middle because this tyranny of the pastor became exposed to the congregation. Under the tyrants, you have the henchmen. The henchmen are the people who devote themselves to exalting the tyrant. They get their significance, their fulfillment from satisfying the tyrant, and that's their service to God. And below that are pretty much nothings, enablers, We all know what an enabler is. He has that problem that Walter Martin spoke of, non-rockabotus. And as long as things just stay calm, everything's fine, even though it's not. Below that are victims, and these are people who have crossed the tyrant. And then there are dissidents, and the dissidents are people who have spoken out and said this is wrong and something needs to be done. Now, I'm going to tell a story that I'll explain the background to when I get into it, but there's a guy named Richard Wood who was a missionary pastor with Greater Grace World Outreach, and when the controversy that was there but latent in the Greater Grace World Outreach Church in Baltimore, Maryland, when that broke out on the internet, Richard Wood was staunchly defending the pastor, Carl Stevens Jr., Carl Stevens, and the leadership of the church. And I was watching the discussion on FactNet, the internet website, and Richard was there day in and day out, laying people low who dared question the church. And then I didn't see him posting for 2 or 3 weeks. And I asked my contact inside Greater Grace, what's with Richard? What's going on with him? And she said, well, don't say anything publicly, but he's coming over to our side. I say that to illustrate that a henchman can go all the way to dissident overnight. It depends on how things happen to them. They can, well, let me put it this way. I've heard the expression that love and hate are just a few degrees separate from each other in the circle, the 100 or the 360 degrees of a circle. Love and hate are very close to each other, and you can cross from one to the other in a short time. But he became a dissident, and he was going to return to Baltimore from Argentina. And the caution that I said to him is, well, he said that he was going to unload on Greater Grace and Carl Stevens. And I said, you better have a uniformed police officer there. He said, no problem. I have an 8th degree black belt. And so, you know, he could handle himself, but it was going to be an ugly situation, at least for a short time. So those are the 5 roles that I find in high control groups. And it helps for a person to understand those roles when they're in the process of understanding the system that led to their abuse. And so they can quickly identify who the players are and where they are in that. Now, I was in a church in Columbus and we were like frogs in the kettle. You know, the old analogy that you turn the heat up slowly and the frog will never know when to get out. It'll just stay there. And legalism was a growing situation. And I had heard people say that the pastor acknowledged that there was a problem of legalism in the church. Why didn't he find out the cause, or why didn't he deal with it? But you know, that kind of thing, as Jesus said, leavens the whole lump. And so Bill Gothard's influence at that church was thoroughgoing. And those of you who are familiar with Bill Gothard's work, you know that it's 5 steps to how to be a good Pharisee and 10 steps to being a tyrant or what have you. But it's legalism 101. And that's not to say that there's not some good content in some of his material, except that there's some percentage of poison in there as well. And so the church was having problems derived from legalism, and I had heard that there were problems, and I had heard that there were some problems with Gothard, but it just didn't rise to my consciousness to deal with it or to study it. And because I was involved with the real Pharisees, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. And so my life in that church just didn't move in the circles that would have seen it manifested. And I think that with Gothard, many times the manifestation of the problem is among the women in the church. That everything funnels down, all the bad stuff funnels down on the women, and they feel the pressure. We had what we call an area-wide crusade, Watchman Fellowship in Columbus, a couple of churches involved, and at our literature table after an evening, the speaker was someone other than me. One of the ladies in the church walked up, and I saw this very fearful look in her eyes. I knew immediately what she was going to ask me for, because I had written a report for the elders of the church on Gothard. You can find it online at the website that addresses Gothard's material, but I forget the name of it to give you directions. Is that Recovering Grace? Pardon?
Is that Recovering Grace?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
And it's in the section of pre-digital material. So this was a long time ago. But I identified the problem as a Galatian problem. The church elders disagreed with me and thought maybe it's a Corinthian problem. And I think it's been borne out since then that it's a Galatian problem. But anyway, this lady approached the table, and I just knew what she was going to ask me about. And I was already reaching under the table to give my summary report about Gothard. And she said, "Do you have any information about Bill Gothard, the Institute in Basic Life Principles?" And I said, "Here." But we had heard the horror stories from some of the people that received Gothardite kind of counsel. Submit to your husband and do horrendous things that they should not ever be asked to do. But in that context of the chain of command and submission to authority and staying under your umbrella of protection, we had an incident that involved my son and the church school. And the issue was, to me, a rather petty issue from my perspective. But from the perspective of the school and the church, it was an assault on Mount Olympus. The chain of command was broken. The umbrella protection was removed, and submission to authority was laughed at, in their eyes. And so they did something that I could not understand how men that I considered to be godly could make such a diametrically opposite decision than they did. And so I went to war for my son. And at this time, the context in my emotional and spiritual state was fairly low. I'd been struggling for years with the day-to-day troubles, pressures of the ministry, and every one of you is full-time in the ministry could probably understand that. But and you know what the issues would be. But I was at a low state, and at that low state, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so that's why I went to war. I was emotionally ready for it. And it came down to a final meeting with the school board, and the chairman of the school board was a thorough Gothardite. And he said, "David, we will let John back into the school, but we want you to not be so confrontational in the future." And I said, "Okay, well, let me ask you a question. In the chain of command between God and me, who has a responsibility for John's education?" The school board chairman didn't answer. Silent. Obvious, pregnant silence. And finally the headmaster said, "You do, David." I said, "Right. So if I find that the authority that I have delegated to you is misused, I'm going to get in your face." And Gothardite just doesn't like that kind of talk back. And so anyway, things ended well after that. But in the middle of this controversy, I was trying to figure out, have I done something wrong? Is there a blind spot in me that doesn't let me see what is real? The same kind of struggle that someone who is a victim of spiritual abuse goes through. Is God mad at me? Am I being judged in some way? And so in the middle of all of this, I get a book in the mail. Debbie Dykstra and her husband Dan sent Jeff Van Vonderen and David Johnson's book, Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. And they said it's like the back door into dealing with the cults. And Dan said later when I talked to him about it, he said it's like the lingua franca, the language of commerce of all of the cults. And I thought that was a good way of talking about it, because you can suggest to someone who is in a cult that they read that book, because it's not about their organization. It's about our churches. And in the process of reading it, they see themselves in the mirror. They see their organization being described. And so it's a useful tool for even the cults. But that gave me an insight that the problem was not with me or our son. It was with a system that was set up by a Pharisee. And so as I was reading that, I was underlining and marking and making notes in the margins. And then I ordered about 20 copies to give to every elder and every school board member. And that really made me popular. And the pastor from the pulpit one morning, I wasn't there, but he said, "Some people will say spiritual abuse, spiritual abuse." And he's obviously talking about me, but at least he didn't name me. But people knew who it was about. So anyway, I had learned the concept of spiritual abuse, but I already knew it because it was in the back of my mind with Jehovah's Witnesses. They were the quintessential Pharisees of our day. And so this just took the focus away from the legalism in the cults and put it in a problem regarding the church. And suddenly I realized there's a whole new world of issues out there. And so after I'd learned this, I got a call from a lady in Sharpsburg, Georgia, and she was a member of a Fighting Fundy church. I think you all know what a Fighting Fundy is. Fundamentalists who will fight at the drop of a hat. And Don Vino has the hat. So. But, yeah. So she was describing this, some probably illegal actions and some certainly unethical actions by the pastor. And then she went on to talk about there's a lot of people in the church who are hurt by these things. And I said, how many people? She said, "Oh, there's lots of them." I said, "Would you be able to get them all together in one location that I could talk to?" "Yeah." And I said, I told her, let's arrange that. Neutral location, someone willing to host it, and I'll come up to Sharpsburg. It's about a 1 hour drive from Columbus. And so I went up there, and this turned out to be the most significant, life-changing event in my life to that point. But I realized it when it was over. I had determined, because I knew the psychology of dealing with the cults. You don't call the Jehovah's Witnesses organization a cult to his face. Right. Defensive wall goes up. Same thing with Mormons and others. You deal with the foundational issues without using pejorative terms. And so that gave me the clue as to how I should deal with this Fighting Fundy church. And so I devised a hierarchy of characteristics that, just think of a pyramid, and the foundation of the pyramid is a performance-based relationship with God, legalism. And then the next level above legalism, and it grows out of legalism, is spiritual abuse. And then the capstone of the pyramid is mind control, brainwashing. And it's at this level that people become willing to drink the Kool-Aid. And so the characteristics are very much alike through each of those three levels, but the difference is in the degree of severity. I have a problem with my voice. I tend to lose it after about 20 minutes or so, but I'll try and power through it. So I started giving those characteristics beginning at legalism, and I was most of the way through legalism. I told the people, raise your hand if you have an example to illustrate this characteristic, and no one was raising their hand. I noticed as the people had come in, there was an apprehension in their eyes. Nobody was, hi Joe, how are you doing? That kind of thing. It was just subtle apprehension and not knowing what's going to happen. And so that's what I had to deal with. But most of the way through legalism, I touched on a characteristic, and this one tentative hand went up, and I called on them. They gave the example of how that fit in this particular church, and the dam broke. Everybody was commenting after that. Somebody had to be first, and someone was brave enough, and now everybody was talking about things. When I had gone that much through legalism, I thought, at this rate, I'm going to be finished with this whole thing in 30 minutes. But then once the dam broke, 3.5 hours later, we got through all of them. But the end of it was that the people who had come went from being apprehensive, looking around like who to trust, or can they say anything, to, hi Joe, how are you? And the psychology had just turned 180 degrees. But I had told the people, and I do this with every meeting that I have with the group, that if you're willing to affirm that you will not share anything said in this meeting, raise your hand. And everybody would raise their hand. And then I tell them that the most important element of finding resolution to your problem is trust. At every level, whether it's trust of God, whether it's trust of the people closest to you, or trust of a pastor, or any level, any relationship has to be based upon real trust. And so everyone here is trusting that everyone here will be silent outside of our group about the things discussed here. Well, there was one Judas who told the pastor about it, and the pastor then got on my case. I was part of a seminar near Sharpsburg, and several churches had sent people to it, and this pastor and one of his deacons came. I recognized him, and I thought during the Q&A time he's going to unload, but he didn't. He had enough dignity to not do that. But then when everything was over and I was taking our materials out to my car, he confronted me in the parking lot. And I basically stiff-armed him. And everything he wanted from me. I want a copy of everything in your files about me and about our church. And I said, first of all, I don't have a file. But if I did, clergy-client confidentiality would prevent me from giving you that. And but I was glad to stiff-arm him This is a guy who needed it. And these kind of people don't take easily to such treatment. But that was the first example of meeting with a group of dissidents. And when I walked out to our car from that meeting that night, I told Carol, this is the most fulfilling ministry experience I've ever had. Because I saw in a few hours despair turn to joy and freedom. And there was about 24 people there, roughly. The next group that I met with were just across the river from Columbus in Phoenix City, Alabama. And it was a small startup church, but the pastor was a controller. And one of the women and it's always the women. Why is that? They are more sensitive to the relational issues than men. And of course, men won't talk about this kind of thing, at least not right away. But after the women have spoken up and identified the problem, then the men will share their insights. That's an interesting observation. But the pastor of this church attended that meeting, and I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know he was a pastor. But I went through the same thing that I'd done with the church in Sharpsburg. And it was only about 5 or 6 people in that meeting. And a sympathetic church in Phoenix City opened their fellowship hall for us to meet in. And the pastor wanted to learn about the issues himself. But that pastor that attended that meeting went on to become the controlling person he always was. He didn't learn anything from what I shared. In fact, he disagreed with it. Not with me directly, but with one of the women that had contacted me from that church. And the next group that I had dealings with was Greater Grace World Outreach in Baltimore. And this one was an email from a woman who is the wife of one of the associate pastors in the church. Her name was Jeannie. And she said, I think we're in a cult, even though we believe things that all Christians believe. The way we're treated is like a cult. And I want to get my husband out. He's an associate on staff at the church. And I said, well, let me suggest something. Get Jeff Van Vonderen's book, Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. Read it, underline it, make notes in the margin about how it applies to Greater Grace, and leave it on the coffee table. And 5 weeks later, I get an email from her, said, it worked, he's out. Wow. So then they both were saying, we have family and friends who are still in, how do we get them out? And I said, you can't do anything direct. And I had in mind, confrontation or something like that, but you can do things that are direct, but in a secondary way, maybe. I said, if you walk up and down the sidewalk in front of the church or the picket sign, you've dismissed yourself as being someone to listen to. So you're going to have to find a way to reach a number of people in the church and confront them with a question, questions about specific things. And she wrote back later and said, I got just the thing. I was one of the people who entered the church membership data into the computers. So I've got the names and addresses of 600 families. And so they made up a postcard. They asked a couple of questions concerning things that were improper in the church, and they directed the people to a thread that had begun years before on FactNet. There was about 6 posts on there, and I said, direct them to that thread and post something on it to get it started. And also they could direct them to my spiritual abuse hotline, dial a message kind of thing. And so my phone my dial message was ringing off the hook, but the FactNet was set up originally to deal with Scientology. And then when this thing with Greater Grace exploded, it exploded. When they finally finished on FactNet, the number of posts was around 90,000. And Scientology was around 35,000. So the upshot of the whole thing was that now the whole church knew what the issues were, and they were talking about it. And you can logically divide or expect in any kind of situation like that on the internet that you're going to have three categories of people. The dissidents who are pointing out the issues, the loyalists who are defending the system, and then the lurkers are always there in the middle. And, talking with Jeannie, I would get background information because she knew all these people who were posting, and she would tell me, so-and-so's coming over. 3 more people this week have come over to the dissident side. And so things were changing, and I asked her one time how many people are involved with Greater Grace World Outreach. I knew that they had churches around the world, and she said probably about 20,000. The mother church in Baltimore was maybe 1,200, 1,500, something like that. And so the final disposition of the things that went on at Greater Grace was that they lost 90% of their churches worldwide. And the people also went with those churches. And the dissident pastors decided to form another interchurch authority or umbrella. I hate that word. But the International Association of Grace Ministries. And so I had pastors calling me from this new association because they had become disillusioned. They had been preaching the orthodox truth as they understood it, and now they understood that that was not true. It was not right. And this is all in the behavioral area with a couple of doctrines that were in the theological area. One of those doctrines is called the one pastor. And whoever leads you to the Lord, he's your pastor for life.
Oh gosh.
But
that's crazy.
Another one.
That's crazy.
Another one, Stevens would say, at the judgment seat of Christ, I'll stand with you and give testimony to Christ about you. Oh joy. What if I cross the pastor? What's he going to say to Jesus about me? Those kind of things are obviously wrong. I mean, Jesus knows all things. He doesn't need Carl Stevens to explain anything to it. So, but that's what you get when you're a frog in the kettle. These kind of things just slowly pile on and they become accepted. So, the disposition was, there's another story. The church, I think, realized they needed to move towards a grace-oriented standard. And so they nominated a man named Roger Stinger to succeed Carl Stevens. Stevens was on his deathbed at the time. And if the church leadership recommends Roger Stinger, then the people will back him. But when on a Wednesday night they were making this nomination, the nurse that was frequently dealing with Carl Stevens stood up and said, I don't know if Brother Carl would approve of this. And so suddenly the approval just went down. He got 56% in spite of that, but what pastor is going to accept a call with 56%? And so he withdrew his nomination. But I got calls from Greater Grace former pastors, and one said, I feel like I was so wrong in mistreating our people with this false legalistic teaching that I should not be a pastor anymore. And I said, do you recognize what the problem is? Do you recognize the contrast between what you have taught and what grace should look like? I said, yeah, I think so. I said, then you're the best person to lead them out of it. And I haven't heard much from them since. One little anecdote, I was speaking to a Sunday school class on a missions conference in Ocoee, Florida, at a large church there. And there was a military guy. He had just been mustered out of the Army, and he didn't have his own transportation. He was hitchhiking, and one of the men in the church picked him up, a man from the service. I was in the service, so I'll help out a brother. And he brought him to the Sunday school class. And I was telling the story about greater grace and my new focus in my ministry dealing with spiritual abuse. And he said, I was saved at Greater Grace on Franklin Street in Baltimore. When he said on Franklin Street, I knew he was telling it right, because that's where it is. And so I said, folks, I said to the whole Sunday school class, this is a divine appointment. The Lord brought him here while we're talking about something mutual between us that we know, so that he can put that behind him and go forward from there. But the next call I got was from Asheville, North Carolina, and there was a number of unethical things. I don't know about the control aspect on the people, but the pastor was, from my appraisal, in it for himself, not for the church. It was an ego thing. He even asked one of the men in the church, who was well off, if he would tithe directly to him rather than in the offering plate. And so,
How convenient.
So it all goes to the same place, the Lord's Word, right?
Yeah.
So that was that man's first clue. This is not right. Something's wrong here. So anyway, they called me, and I went up to Asheville and met with them. Met a couple of times. They had different groups that came in at different times, but my standard procedure is to go through those characteristics, and people tell me the examples. That way, when it gets back to the pastor, I can honestly say I never said anything about you or your church. I just told the characteristics that are common in all of the abusive legalistic systems, and if the shoe fits, you have to wear it. But funny, unrelated thing in this man had just started a year or two before with a big log carving a wooden Indian, and painted it. When it was finished, he was going to give it to his oldest son, and oh no, I got 3 sons, I got to do 3 of them. So he was on the 3rd one, but he had taken the first one and had placed it in the corner of the living room. And it's a dark room, and I make eye contact with people like I'm doing here, and I realized halfway through I'm making eye contact with a wooden Indian. So, and I used a little example of equity rescuing, that we're going to have a dollar auction, and the auction is for this dollar. You bid a penny. If no one bids against you, 1 penny you lose, 99 cents you gain. And so who will make the first bid? Oh, by the way, there's a little codicil to this, that whatever you bid, even if you don't win the bid, you pay that. That's the equity that people try to rescue when the bid gets up to 90 cents or so. And we went through this little process of people bidding, and it was over $1, so the 2 or 3 people that were bidding realized I'm in the hole already. And so that's what happens with equity rescuing. You need to cut your losses. You need to recognize that you're throwing away your life and your vitality and time and resources and this to something that's worth it. But I've made friends that have lasted for years through these interventions. And the next one is in Sterling, Virginia, and this is probably the baddest of the bad that I've dealt with. It's called Calvary Temple. You can look it up in Sterling, Virginia. And it used to be an Assembly of God, and the pastor did not like the authority of the denomination over him, so he took out the Assembly of God, and now they're just Calvary Temple Church. And so now he doesn't have anyone over him, and he's a car guy. I can understand that. I'm a car guy. And so their idea was to host or go to car shows with the cars that he had and people in the church had, and do evangelism, actually recruiting to the cult. You know, they call it evangelism. But, the cars that he had were purchased with church money. So he had custody of them, but they did not belong to him. And he was the one who used them. There's a Ferrari. There's a classic GTO. Cars on this level worth scores of thousands of dollars. And when the dissidents got their wind, they broadcast this to the Washington Post and some other local media outlets, and to the IRS. And so the IRS was asking this guy, do these cars belong to you? Oh no, they belong to the church. They're for a ministry outreach that we have. Who drives them? Well, I do. Does anyone else in the church drive them? No. That pretty much tells the story right there. And so the IRS was on this case, and I haven't heard that they've dropped it, but it's a long time, so I don't know if they're going to do anything or not. But one of the things I was impressed with in this is the number of broken families. If you see something that's wrong in the church and you speak up, you're kicked out. If you leave without speaking up, they keep your family. You don't go with them. And so a lot of the people that we met with were describing families, there's family members that were still in the group. And there's child sexual abuse allegations that are going on. And that was the case with Greater Grace as well. I lost my train of thought. There are websites that have sprung up with a lot of these groups. Calvary Temple has a website that exposes them, and it's called Against Calvary Temple. So you can Google that and find it. Greater Grace has a couple of websites. One has the name Carl Stevens in it. I can't recall the address, but just Google Greater Grace and you'll find them.
What is it, Word of Grace?
No, Greater Grace.
Greater Grace, okay.
Yeah, World Outreach. But all of these incidents were very fulfilling for me as a missionary to the cults, and now a missionary to the abused church. And I call these people, the dissidents and the enablers and the victims, I call them friendly fire casualties. That they got wounded just trying to serve God. And when I was dealing with Greater Grace World Outreach, I was, for the sake of the dissidents at Greater Grace, that I was putting out a weekly e-letter that addressed an issue of spiritual abuse. And when I had finished doing those, they ran their course, I thought, there's something in this. I need to keep this and put it together in some format. So I did, and that's the Spiritual Abuse Recovery Workbook. And the It's on my table if you're wanting one. I printed 500 copies of that the first time, and I told a couple of people at my table, I sold one of those 500. I gave 499 away because I know what it's like to be in turmoil of the soul, trying to understand what's going on. And they read this and it helps them. But I get calls from individuals as well. And as soon as I know that it's a spiritual abuse related issue, I say, let me ask you some questions. Does the group you're in control information? Yeah. If you experience some misfortune, do they say that it's because of a lack of faith or obedience? If you disagree with them, do they label you in some way? And I frequently get answers this way. And I said, your answers so far, and I'll go through the rest of these answers, tell me that you're in an abusive, controlling system. I use the word system rather than church because this does have a system. When at first you practice to deceive, tangled web you weave, and that's what happens. You have to defend wrong with more wrong, and you create a web, a system that supports it. But once I go through these characteristics with the person on the phone, their tone changes from desperation and anguish to cheer. They find reliefs in that. And Jesus said it, you'll know the truth and the truth will make you free. And so those are my war stories. Y'all have any questions? I don't know how much time we have left, maybe a few minutes. Yes,
the name before Bread of Grace, would you want to say anything about the Bible Speaks, which preceded it?
Yeah, the Bible Speaks. It was Carl Stevens' first outfit in Berwick, Massachusetts. And in researching this, I realized he had had connections in Maine, Massachusetts, and then, like many cults, when they lose their reputation, they change their name and move. And that's what they did. They lost their reputation in Massachusetts and moved to Baltimore. But there was enough doctrinal orthodoxy in what Stevens was saying that it caught the attention of a friend of mine in Florida who was talking about it. But that's all it was. It just caught his attention. He didn't do anything more with it. But that's one of the reasons why these groups are so dangerous. They have our doctrinal statement, but they don't have our, there's two terms that have been used in church history, faith and practice. Faith is your doctrine. Practice is how you live it. And the practice in these groups is horrible. But Stevens had used undue influence to finagle a donation from Betsy Dovey Dennis. What was it, $5 million or $6 million? Six. And yes.
There's more to it. There's 19 million altogether.
Yeah.
They were going to try to get that through Betsy's will if she died, and she was supposed to go to Africa. And the intervention that took place was timely because of the nature of what that could have meant for Betsy.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said at the beginning of this talk, there are some pros in here that know specifics about some of the groups I've dealt with that I don't know or have forgotten. But so, yeah, David Clark was involved with them long before I was. But Betsy was a key topic of conversation on the FactNet site. Any other questions? Yes.
What kind of books do you recommend on the topic of grace, or on a biblical orientation on what is freedom from the law like, and what is Christian liberty look like?
Yeah. For families, Jeff Van Vonderen's book, Families Where Grace is in Place, is a good one. There's another one, I can't remember the title or the author, So when my senior moment passes, I'll tell you.
Like Classic Christianity by Bob George, or no, or
I haven't read that one.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have a follow-up question, not a follow-up, but it's entirely a different question. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the conflict between like the senior pastor and associate or junior pastor,
Yeah.
because one of the things that I'm curious about is that there are some people who just by their managerial nature, they're very hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to do it myself if you want it done right. And there's the other issue of legalism, and I wonder how one connects to the other, because they seem related, but maybe they're not. Maybe it's just one person just wants to say, if you got to have something done right, you got to look and inspect everything.
Yeah.
Another person says, well, you've got to obey the law, and these laws that I give are the ones that are necessary for you to be sanctified. So can you talk on some of that senior pastor, junior pastor, managerial style?
In the book that I read, the key issue was narcissism, and the senior pastor was a narcissist. And he would give you responsibility, but not the authority to carry it out. And so he was constantly correcting, even in the staff meetings and deacon board meetings. A pastor who is looking over the shoulder of his associate staff and is not a narcissist or controller, he will run into conflict probably very quickly. And in the process, will probably learn, I need to back off. And a lot of times it depends on the polity of the church. If it's congregational, like a Baptist church, he's thinking, I can be run out of here. If it's hierarchical, like Episcopal, Presbyterian, something like that, he might have more leeway. But one of the things that Setzer said in his book is that his estimate is that 30% of megachurch pastors are narcissistic. And you can imagine a narcissist is going to build a big church. It's just a given with their personality. Unless he fails at some way on the way up, but that's what he's going to work towards. And the church that we were in that was pastored by such a man, he went all the way up, built a mega church, 4,500 members, had moved from not poor beginnings, but a respectable middle class, good sized facility up to upscale and large. And he had built it himself, unfortunately. And when the stinky stuff hit the fan, he created quite an issue about it. He bent the rules, and he ended up being let go a year or two later, and they got a new pastor who was very similar. And then he failed, and now they've got a good guy in there. So they will never recover from where they were back then, I don't think, unless something dynamic happens. But they're healthy now, spiritually speaking. I can't get more into the dynamics than that, but the associate staff just can't stand the standing over their shoulder and being embarrassed publicly with their associates. And the thing that caused things to go public at that church was the youth minister that just had too much. And so he sent a letter out to the parents of the youth defining what the problem was. And so he immediately became the bad guy. And he resigned rather than be fired, but he brought the whole church's attention to the problem, and then the church just split down the middle. People wanting the pastor to stay at all costs, people wanting the pastor to stay but get help with the problems he had that led to this. And because he was loved, everybody wanted him to be there, but he refused, and so that's why he ended up having to leave. So that's the characteristic of a narcissist, and if you've got that, compromise is not a reasonable alternative.